Hello and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Teel James Glenn, or TJ. Hey, TJ, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Very nice to meet you and everyone viewing.
Oh, we are happy to have you here. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Teel James Glenn has killed or been killed hundreds of times on stage and screen as he has traveled the world for 40 plus years as a stuntman, swordmaster, storyteller, bodyguard, actor, and haunted house barker. He's proud to have studied sword under Errol Flynn's last stunt double, and he has made hundreds of appearances in Renaissance festivals, soap operas, and feature films, including having been beaten up by Hawk on the Spenser for Hire TV show. He has also published dozens of novels, and his poetry and stories have been printed in over 200 magazines, including Weird Tales, Mystery, Pulp Adventure, and more. His novel, A Cowboy in Carpathia, a Bob Howard adventure, won Best Novel in 2021 in the Pulp Factory Award, and he is also the winner of the 2012 Pulp Ark Award for Best Author. And I invited TJ on the podcast to talk about this is going to become one of a series of mistakes writers make episodes. And we're going to be talking about mistakes writers make about fight scenes and how to avoid them. And this is going to join other entries in this series, which are police roles with Frank Zafiro, forensic psychiatry with Susan Hatters Friedman, PIs with Patrick Hoffman, the FBI with Jerry Williams, first responders with Ken Fritz, coroners with Jennifer Grazer Dornbush, police procedure with Bruce Coffin, and firearms with Chris Grahl of Tactical. And that set of podcast episodes became so popular that I finally created a little listen list on the indieauthor.com/podcast. So if you're writing crime fiction or a topic that includes any of those topics, you'll be able to find all those mistakes writers make and how to avoid them all in one place. And so we're going to be adding to that list mistakes writers make about fight scenes. And I'd like to start out asking TJ, what got you started as a stuntman?
I was thinking about that actually last night, very specifically. I was a very sickly kid. I couldn't take gym. I couldn't do any sports, asthma, sickly. I looked like a potato with pipe cleaners stuck in me. And when I was 15, I went to a Phil Seuling comic convention. And I was a reader of comic books, of course. And I saw chapter 2 of The Adventures of Captain Marvel movie serial made in 1941. And the stunt work in it by a guy named Dave Sharp and the editing and shooting were so amazing. You really did believe a man could fly. You really did see guys flipping around. And I went, I want to do that. And I started making Super 8 movies in high school. I read every single thing I could on stunts and movie serials and how they did it. I taught myself how to do stair falls at my high school with washcloths wrapped with ace bandages around my elbows and knees on the marble stairs, still wearing my glasses because I couldn't see otherwise. I learned to do high falls off of garage roofs and how to build box rigs, all of it from reading it, seeing any behind the scenes footage I could. And then, of course, I went to art school. But the last night in art school, before I was supposed to graduate, I met a guy at a party who was auditioning people for a film. And on a lark, because I knew about film and I'd been making my own little stupid Super 8 movies, Captain Marvel, Rockman. I went, I got a part in it, and then he needed somebody to storyboard it and to choreograph a fight. And I knew how they did it in the movies. And so that got me started. And once I did that, I ended up getting a lead in the movie, although he lost the equipment halfway through and the film never got finished. But that led me to other movies and then said, I got to get some training. So I was researching a book I was writing that had a sword fight. And I took a friend of mine who had studied with Ralph Faulkner in California, who was the sword master in a lot of the Errol Flynn movies, said, hey, there's this guy teaching stage combat in the city. You want to come with me to the class? I went, heck yeah. So I took Swashbuckling 101. And the minute I held the sword in my hand, I knew that's what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. It literally was like heavenly choir and lights coming on me. At that point, I started to train to be able to hold the sword, to be able to move, to be able to breathe. And I never looked back. I studied with my first instructor for 3-4 years, ended up going when he started a Renaissance fair. I was one of the instructors. Then I went auditioned for other Renaissance fairs, ultimately ended up doing 60 Renaissance fairs. as either the fight choreographer, the assistant choreographer, the jouster, or for the last bunch of years, I jobbed in a story show. And what was cool about that was I would do storytelling, the voices and characters and stuff. And my daughter did it with me starting when she was 8.
Oh,
So she,
cool.
my partner, every year we did at least one ring fair together for a weekend where she would beat me up with the quarterstaff at the beginning of the show because everybody likes to see the big guy beaten up. And when we started, she was, down here. The last time we did it was just before she went off to college, and she was 6'3".
Wow.
It wasn't funny anymore. It was just an old guy fighting a woman. It wasn't the giant fighting the little girl. So she did the last quarterstaff fight on her knees, so it looked funny. And she still beat, of course. So that's it. And from learning the stage combat, I ended up getting parts in films, low budget movies, soap operas, where they would need a big guy who could be the tough guy and could throw a punch. And so I would often get hired as an actor, and then they would add stunts, or they would hire me as a stuntman and realize I could act, and they would start beefing my part up. But a lot of my roles were, hey, you can't come in here, and there'd be a fight. So that was sort of the main part of the career.
I have to ask what happened between the asthmatic child that looked like a potato with the pipe cleaners. Did something happen that enabled you to take part in those activities, or did taking part in those activities help address?
That's it. I had the will to push through it now because there was something I believed in. I don't care about sports. I still don't. So the idea of like training to run around a field and throw a pigskin, why would you do that? But training to be able to sustain a sword fight and do a Shakespearean monologue in a show, yes, I would train for that. I used to live at the top of a hill, and you'd have to come up through stone stairs in a park. And my stage combat class, the beginning was in Saturday mornings. I would literally have to crawl up the stairs. At the end of the class, I could not function. I still carry an inhaler with me to this day. I'm still asthmatic. Not as bad as I was as a child, fortunately. One of the first fight choreographers, Jim Manley, who hired me as his assistant, severely asthmatic, always had his inhaler with him. And I can't run a block, but I can do a fight. I can jump off a building. And by the end of a martial arts class, I would be almost like a non-functional lump, but I'd made it through alive. And that was always an achievement for me. So it never went away. My reason for fighting it was stronger than the actual disease.
Yeah, that's a great story. We had sort of come up with a couple of categories about in which we wanted to discuss the idea of mistakes writers make about fight scenes. And we've talked about bladed weapons already a couple of times. So I'd like to start with that one. What are some mistakes writers make? And if you have any good or bad examples from movies people might be familiar with, that's always a fun way to illustrate it.
Yeah. I almost always end up pulling movie references because most people haven't read obscure Raphael Sabatini books or whatever.
Yeah.
But first thing is when people say sword, there are hundreds of types of swords, different weights, and each sword has a different purpose. When people are thinking fights, for instance, the Conan movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, all right, I will always and forever say that was junk because the Milius got his samurai instructor to teach Arnold how to use a sword, which makes no sense because samurai swords and broadswords don't work anywhere like each other. And it would the equivalent of having a bicyclist teach someone how to do motocross racing because they're completely separate. And so everything he does with the broadsword is essentially wrong. And he moves like such a truck that anyone should have been able to kill him immediately. On the other hand, you see a movie like Lady Hawk with Rutger Hauer. William Hobbs, who choreographed it, was the swordmaster in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. He did the Three and Four Musketeers with Michael York. He did the Mel Gibson Hamlet. He did the Cyrano with Giappaldo. And so he would study the specific weapon and teach you how to use that weapon. So the broadsword techniques in Lady Hawk are real broadsword techniques. and you can see he moves completely differently. And, and it really wouldn't have been a bad thing if they said, we got a samurai guy. Okay, we'll give him a curved sword. So why Sandal Bergman actually looks like she knows what she's doing. Aside from being a dancer, she had a curved sword. So she was actually doing curved sword techniques. And
Yeah.
samurai swords cut on the draw. They don't cut on the extension. So it's a completely different way of cutting. So again, it's a stupid little nuance, but it's the kind of thing that drives me sane.
The scene that this reminds me of is, and I'm not coming up with the name of the movie, but there was a movie with Liam Neeson.
That would be Rob Roy.
Rob Roy. And there's that scene where he has what I guess is a broadsword. You can correct my
Yeah,
terminology.
he's a Scottish broadsword, basket hilt broadsword, and
he's fighting the guy
with a small sword.
Yeah, or like a fencing thing almost.
It's actually that was they were contemporary at the same time. The basket hilt broadsword was basically a war weapon, and the walking sword or court sword that I forget the actor's name. He's always playing horrible human beings, and he's also really tiny. But he was using a contemporary what the noblemen would have worn on their hip walking around. They called it a walking sword. And in that fight, he would have killed Liam Neeson in about 20 seconds.
Really?
Because he had the lunge. The lunge gives you extension. Also, those basket hilt swords, the Rob Roy, who Liam Neeson was playing, fought 60 duels in his life. Never lost a duel. His last duel was when he was 63 years old, which at that point was old. We've pushed the extension of things. They wanted to make Liam Neeson the underdog. But in fact, if Liam Neeson's sword had ever actually contacted the court sword, it would have snapped it in half like a toothpick. Yeah. So they had to work really hard to make you think the other guy was going to win. Where if he'd gotten a lunge in that fight the way it was choreographed, Liam Neeson was dead. But in reality, the guy with the big hacking sword with the longer arms would have won if he got him on the first cut. If you miss while you're down there, the guy just lunges and you're dead. There's historical evidence of samurai swords against rapiers in Portuguese against bandits in the China Seas. And the Portuguese always won because a cutting sword requires an arc. A lunging sword does not. So while you're doing this, he's going meh, meh, like a sewing needle, and you're done.
Yeah. So that's an interesting, I imagine that in Rob Roy, they futzed with the reality because they needed that scene to extend longer.
Yes, absolutely.
So, and are there tips you can share that say, even like, how can someone do a realistic sword scene, but extend it to extend the drama of the situation?
If you ever see any of these commentaries on YouTube where they'll have, swordmaster looks at a real thing and tells you, the one thing all of them will say is that most fights, even if they last a long time, it's because nobody's doing anything. As soon as the blades start touching, the fight's over real quick because it is a case of who makes the first mistake. One of the things I have a sword and sorcery series, and in any of my stuff, if I talk about people fighting with swords, I talk about the type of sword. Because certain swords have an innate advantage over other swords. And because of that, you then have to say, I want my hero to have a disadvantage. So the other guy will have an arm that's 3 inches longer. Or my hero will have a stiff shoulder because he fell off his horse, to give them a disadvantage with that. But in terms of, it's a case of just looking at the weapons and going, how is it used? And always, it's not the weapon, it's the individual using it. If somebody is skilled, the biggest problem I always see is people pick up a sword in some movie or in some book against someone who's actually trained in that weapon and somehow win. It doesn't work that way. Even when they were training for combat, you trained with a weapon which was as close to the real weapon you was using as possible. Even to the point where in Hamlet's time, when they talk about foiled swords, they would take their real swords and wrap it in metal foil and stick a golf ball on the end of it. because you wanted the actual weight of your weapon in your hand. If it's lighter, you're not going to learn how to use your weapon correctly. And the familiarity with it often is the answer. Now, a good swordsman is supposed to be able to use multiple weapons, but you always have your favorite. Everybody, it's like everyone even has their favorite chair. You get used to certain things. And with any weapon, that weapon, even when I'm teaching stage combat or choreographing shows, I assign specific stage swords to specific actors and say, that's yours. Because the balance of every sword is a little different. The weight of it is a little different. For instance, if you hand me a sword that I've never used before, and I'm immediately into battle, I really am not going to be familiar with how it moves. And that would be a disadvantage, which you can turn as the protagonist gets used to it, perhaps, into, okay, now I know what I'm doing. But it gives you a nice disadvantage, even with a skilled fighter. The other thing that drives me nuts, and this is just the thing about cover artists and comic book artists. You don't switch your sword from one hand to the other unless you're Cornell Wilde, because you always have a strong side. Cornell Wilde in the old movies, the big trick at the end of every movie, he'd get stabbed in the right arm and he'd have to do the final fight with his left hand. He was really a left-handed guy. He had to learn to do right-handed when he was competing for the Olympics. And so this was actually his strong side, but he learned to use the right. And 99% of people, or 98%, are right-handed. So a left-handed fencer always has an advantage because people are not used to going up against it.
It makes me think of the scene in The Princess Bride, of course.
Yes. Believe it or not, that's the other thing. In the text, they go, I see you've learned your capoeira. But I will use my morozzo against you in uneven ground. They quote all these specific techniques and they don't use a single one of them in the movie. The writer took time to research them, so they actually used real technique. If you choreograph the fight that's in the book, it's a real fight.
Oh,
and
interesting.
They're really using real techniques. Goldman did his research. But for the movie, they said, no, we just wanted to look an Errol Flynn fight. So they had the dialogue, but they weren't doing Marozzo or Capoeira.
Oh, that's very disappointing.
You know what? It's still one of my favorite movies of all time. So
yeah,
because when you're choreographing fights, the first service is to the story.
Yeah.
The second, when you're doing it with real people, then it's the story. And then if you're lucky, you can educate a little.
Yeah.
But when you're just writing it, it's always got to serve the story first. And you can always fudge it if you don't know what to do with it. You could make it impressionistic, the feelings of the fight without actually describing.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking that's kind of related to that is that when you were describing, and people who are just listening maybe can pop over to YouTube and watch, but you were sort of illustrating why someone who is swinging a sword is at a disadvantage over someone who's thrusting a sword. We're using different terminology, but that's very apparent. Like if you were watching a movie scene, I think even someone who knew nothing about swordplay would understand that. But when you're describing it, that would be hard to convey in writing.
Honestly, I don't think it is, just because you literally can say, I looked at him and he had a curved war sword. And he had to swing it. I was lucky. Mine was straight. If I could avoid that first swing, I could stab him.
Yeah.
And I have a scene in one of my books that the two friends are fighting different bad guys. And the one guy has a two-handed sword and he's against a bunch of straight-handed people. And the other one, she's fighting a guy with a curved sword. She has a straight sword. So literally in the middle of the fight, they switch so that it goes straight to straight, curve to curve to even it out a little. Because she had an advantage, the guy with the curved sword, but her buddy had none. She's also the better swordsman than him. So it makes sense. She could take on the two guys with straight swords and he would take on the one guy with the curve. But you can build it in as part of the jeopardy for your hero. Also the length of the sword matters. I'm sorry, size matters. If your hero is a petite woman, and even if she's an expert swordswoman, as my character Irina is, she has a sword that's scaled for her body. And so she will have less length than some goon she goes up against who's 6 inches, 8 inches taller than her, who therefore has longer arms. And therefore, even if he had the same length sword, had an advantage. She has to make up for it by being more fleet and trying to get inside his range, so that her blade is effective. So there's a lot of factors you can use to even the fights up or uneven them against your hero. The other thing is, there's an old saying that the greatest swordsman in France is not afraid of the second greatest. They're afraid of the worst. And so literally, someone who has no idea what they're doing, what can be on their side? They can just swing wild, hit the right spot. I mean, how many times you accidentally hit somebody's funny bone when you were reaching for something? That could happen with a sword, to hit that one spot. There's a very funny story about if you've ever seen the movie The Court Jester with Danny Kaye, there's a scene in it where he's going up against Basil Rathbone, who was an excellent real fencer and a great stage combat fencer. But Danny's character is hypnotized to be the greatest with a blade. Unless you do this, then he's unhypnotized and he's a complete boom. In the sequences where he's the greatest with the blade, Danny Kaye learned it so quickly and so good that the fight choreographer had to double Basil Rathbone because he couldn't keep up with the speed of Danny Kaye. On the other hand, there's a sequence where he's out in a courtyard and he goes to Rathbone, "Your life's not worth that." And he's suddenly confused. And there's a scene where he's running around screaming, throwing the sword in the air. And you can see Basil Rathbone doing this. And Rathbone said, "Neither one of us knew what he was going to do. And I was the only time I've ever been terrified with a sword in my hand." Because he could have literally stabbed him. He could have killed him. He was just running around being wild and crazy. So that can work too. You can work to have the guy you're up against, if you do something insane, they'll be like, "What are you doing?" Because also people who train in a style, and this is what Bruce Lee was against, when you train in one style, you're used to certain answers to certain movements. I do this, he always does this. Well, if you go up a completely different style you've never seen before, you have no idea what they're going to do. If you do this and you expect them to do that, but they do this, suddenly it throws your whole world out of kilter, which is why in a lot of cultures you would go around training in different schools because everybody had their secret, both the secreta, their secret move, and each school would teach it. And you'd try to stay there long enough to learn their secret. And then you go on to the next school to learn their secret. Because in a fight, you're not going to face a peer. You're going to face a peer maybe, but you're not going to face an equal. No fight is ever equal, even if you both have the same training, the same body, the same skill level. One of you is going to be more motivated, or one of you is going to be tired from not getting enough sleep. So it's always, you might be equivalent, but it's never going to be exactly equal. Yeah. And that also works to give tension. When I have characters who are heroes who've had real training, I have to make sure they just don't Mary Sue their way through a story. They can walk in a room and kill everybody in the room. They're John Wick. I'll kill everybody and move on. Otherwise, there's just no tension. I mean, nobody really worries that John Wick is going to die.
Yeah.
It's just, how is he going to kill them?
Yeah.
It becomes like the Columbo of action films. He's going to win. You just want to see how.
That makes me think of another interesting dramatic twist, which is the calm, cool, and collected combatant against the frantic, desperate combatant. And you could play that either way. You could say, yes, because he was frantic and panicked, he lost the fight. Or because he was frantic and panicked and had nothing to lose, and he was perhaps not trained, what you were saying before.
Crazy strength is a real thing.
Yeah.
They train you in martial arts. The reason they want you to fight calm and not fight angry or excited is because physiologically, when you have adrenaline in your system, you have the fight or flight. Because of that, your body thinks, okay, I'm going to need energy to run away. It will start shutting down finer motor nerves. It cuts off power to certain things. So the old trope about somebody not being able to get their key in the door when the bad guy's coming after them, that's true, because when you're in a frightened state, you lose fine motor nerves. So one of the reasons for martial arts repetition, and swords are martial arts, as are guns really as well, is You want to build a sense of this is the way you do it, and you're calm about it, that you don't fight angry and you don't fight scared. You put that away and you get angry or you get afraid after the fight is over. One of the nice things, if anybody's ever read Modesty Blaze, or maybe I'm giving my age away, they were great books. One of the true first female heroes who actually Emma Peel was somewhat modeled on. And one of her character traits is she will be phenomenal through a fight, very cool-headed. Afterwards, she falls apart hysterically, but only in her friend Willie's arms. That's her complete release. She literally bottles all the emotion and at the end explodes. It's her own way to deal with her own PTS. And he wrote this in the early 60s before there was a real understanding of PTS. So, I mean, I give much kudos to him, Peter O'Donnell, the writer. But you really, you can use the crazy because you will do things, you will take chances that no sane fighter would do that. And yet you'll do it. I had a friend, the first time he was in France, they still have rapier and dagger fighting as a competition. And now it's been revived with HEMA. But back in the 70s, HEMA wasn't doing that stuff yet. And
what is HEMA?
Oh, historical European martial arts.
Okay.
It was an answer to the huge explosion of martial arts, which everyone thinks is everything. They really mostly referring to Asian. But the European martial arts are absolutely sophisticated, but we got guns earlier. And so they sort of became less a part of the world curriculum. But the more isolated communities in the East kept the older techniques alive much longer. But anyway, he was in a competition. And one of the things they allowed there, he didn't realize he's busy, parrying, blocking with rapier and dagger. And he parries something and the guy goes, hip, and throws the dagger at him. And he said, I was standing there and I watched this thing through my mask coming at me in slow motion going, this can't possibly, and the guy won the point because they're allowed to throw the weapons.
Interesting.
Now, no one in a sane fight would throw away their only weapon.
Right.
But in this case, he had parried the sword with both of his. So the guy had a freeze, but he wasn't in range to stab him. So he just threw it. And it's an insane move in a real fight. But on the other hand, he hit him. Now, in a real fight, maybe the guy would have dogged his head. But at the same time, that would have thrown his timing off and you might have been able to kill him with the sword. Crazy stuff is perfectly justifiable. The best knife fight I ever saw in any movie, the most realistic, was years ago. They used to have little video boxes outside movie theaters that would run a clip of a movie. And some Spanish film, I don't know what it was, Mexican or Spanish film, because I don't speak Spanish, on 48th Street, Manhattan. And these two guys are in a pool hall. They both got knives, and they're kind of doing this mirror thing back and forth. One moves in, the other moves back. The other moves left, that guy moves right. And then the first time one of them commits, he starts to lunge with it. The other guy reaches back, grabs a pool cue, and breaks it over his head. Most realistic sword knife fight I've ever seen. Not the fight in Under Siege where they go, and they add in the sound effects of knife blades. You don't really parry with knives. They're too small. Even Bowie knives are just too small. And the chances of actually catching it on your blade are minuscule. Again, an insane person or an unskilled person might do it. And that would be the 1 in 1,000 times it worked.
Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at the Indy Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/the Indy Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. Well, I think that pool hall scene suggests an interesting scenario, which is the person who is carrying a knife because they intend to get in a fight and win, and the person who's carrying a knife because they're striking a pose, that they're threatening, but they're not positioning themselves in a way that they're imminently about to have an attack. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like if someone's using it mainly as a prop to threaten.
Yes. Well, it's the whole bully scenario. People who bluster very seldom have the courage to carry through. I always tell actors when I'm working with them, don't play tough. Tough people don't pose. Tough people just are. They don't have to go, hey, oh, or, they just look at you and go, if you do that again, I'll kill you. It's just there. The mindset, and the samurai will talk about this a lot, is that every fight is won or lost before the first blow is struck. It is the mindset and the commitment, because you can't stop someone who's interested in hurting you and doesn't care about whether they get hurt or not. You cannot stop a determined assassin who does not care about their own safety, which is the whole going back to the crazy person. If a mother is protecting her child, she will leap onto a sword to throw the guy off a cliff with her. She won't parry it. She will do whatever it takes to make sure the child is safe. And if someone feels that the reason for defeating you is greater than their own personal safety, they will win the fight or have to be hacked down to the point where they can't function. I always say that I fight like Brian Boru until 5 minutes after I'm dead. The reason that the Norse feared him is that he was just that crazy. He would just charge, large masses of people. And there's an incident in Mexico when every year the Foreign Legion salutes a wooden hand. And it was because it had been a lieutenant in a detachment when Maximilian was occupying Mexico. The lieutenant had a wooden hand from a previous engagement. And there was a bunch of legionnaires that were trapped in a hacienda surrounded by hundreds of Juaristas. And the lieutenant was killed, but the sergeant made them all swear on his wooden hand they would never surrender. And it got to the point where there were like 5 of them left. 2 of them were wounded. They had no bullets, and they fixed bayonets and charged the Mexicans. And the Mexicans were like, you see this? And they didn't fire because they were like, these guys are crazy. And they didn't fire and didn't fire. And the guy stepped in closer. And finally somebody went, hey, we got to do something about this. And they all got up and surrounded them with bayonets to their throat and said, surrender. And the corporal, who was the only leader at that point, said, the Legion does not surrender, you surrender. And they've all got bayonets at their throat. And so the Mexican commander said, I'll tell you what, let's call it a truce. And he said, we leave with our colors and our wounded comrades. And the Mexicans were like, you got it. And they saluted them as they marched out.
Wow.
Their determination, it was like the Alamo, but they won.
Yeah.
Their determination, their spirit was stronger than the people they were fighting, because it really wasn't their battle anyway. They were occupying a foreign country, but it was for the honor of the Legion. And that's one of the things is we've instilled a lot of artificial values in humans. One of them is the whole honor, flag, country, family. Family is the only one of those that's kind of a natural thing. You would protect your pack and you would protect your offspring. The others have sort of been manufactured to give reason for people to do things. Like I said, my reason to become fit, or at least appear to be fit, which is hilarious. People always used to say I was a physical guy, and I'm still not, never was. My reason to be fit was to be able to hold a sword. So that overcame my physical tiredness, my sickness, the exhaustion and stupidity. Sometimes I think back on what I did as a 20, 30-year-old, I'm like, how come I'm still alive? I went on to have people set me on fire for money. So
that could be a whole other podcast episode. But I wanted to use that as a takeoff. I want to stick with the bladed weapons conversation because I think we're delving into a great topic. And that is one of the other things we wanted to talk about was the wounds and the reaction to wounds and realistic portrayal. And we've talked a couple of times about what adrenaline does for you. And we were just mentioning people fighting for things like family and honor and so on. So what do you see in movies if you're the recipient of the bladed weapon attack? What do you see that is good or bad? What should people try for or avoid?
I do a lecture on guns and violence with weapons that way. And one of the things is Matt Dillon, in 20 years of Gunsmoke, was shot 50 times and knocked unconscious 20. And in 8 years on air, Maddox was shot 20 times and knocked unconscious 37. Now, if you're knocked unconscious, that's a concussion. You have enough concussions, you don't talk right, you don't walk right, you're neurologically done. If you're shot, there's trauma shock. If you're stabbed, one of the things in duels, realistically, most duels post 1600 in Europe, especially if it was a duel of honor, you fought stripped to the waist, male or female. And the reason for that was they figured out that if you drive fabric into the wound, which you would if you're stabbing somebody wearing the cotton shirt, there's always going to be some cotton fibers in there. They will fester and you'll die of the infection. More people died of infections after sword fights than the actual cuts or thrusts. Now, I've been stabbed. I was stabbed in the stomach when I was doing a movie. And one of the guys I was working with, we're doing a sequence, and he misses the mark and he just stabbed me in the stomach. And I looked down and said, "Damn it, Scott, you fricking stabbed me." And he looked at me and, "Yeah, sorry about that." So fortunately or unfortunately, I had enough blood, and he stopped it as soon as he made contact with my body, but I still have a stab mark. It went in about maybe that much.
And that much being like an inch for people who are listening, but
yeah, that's right. I'm sure he's doing it verbally. Yeah, I hit maybe about an inch, and any penetration anywhere on the torso, and in most of the other, in the limbs even, any penetration more than 2 inches, you will hit a vital organ. Which is why there used to be a rule in New York that you couldn't have a knife. First, you can't have a knife that's two-edged ever, because the only purpose for a two-edged knife is to kill. That's a weapon. And you couldn't have it longer than 2 fingers width. When you hold 2 fingers up and you measure from one side to the other, because that's a little bit less than 2 inches, because it's supposedly to reduce the chance of fatal injuries if someone has a knife and uses it in a fight. Swords, you can survive a 8-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch slash with much greater chance of recovering almost completely than you could a 3-inch stab anywhere on your torso. Because that 3-inch stab will go into liver, kidney, heart, lungs. And at a point in history, there was no way to stop sucking chest wounds. There was no way to stop a punctured lung. You either recovered or you didn't. Jim Bowie was stabbed and shot and clubbed and spent, I think it was 7 months recovering, because he had a thrust through the lung. And after that, everybody considered him a Superman, that he was unkillable in the famous sandbar fight. So infection was a very big risk. One of those odd things about history is the Mongols wore very light armor. They wore silk shirts. And one of the reasons they wore silk shirts is because when they were hit with an arrow, it would not penetrate the silk. It would push the silk into the wound. And you literally could then grab the edges of the shirt and work it to pop the arrow back out. So it reduced the chances, A, of infection. Silk didn't infect. And B, it literally reduced the chances of penetration because silk was a stronger fabric. It's funny now, we have spiders weaving spider silk Kevlar fibers to be used in bulletproof or bullet resistant vests now. So we've taken modern technology and gone backwards. If you look at modern riot armor, it looks like 15th century fighting armor, because what worked then still works now. If someone's going to hit you with something, you're protected in those areas. However, there were some wounds they could not heal. There was something called the Coupe de Jarnac, a very famous duel between the Comte de Jarnac and a favorite of one of the Louis. And dueling was forbidden, except this was a fair of honor. They got all dressed up in their armor, and the Comte de Jarnac had his swordmaster. He says, "Look, we're in armor. I'm not that good with a sword. Can you teach me something? Something that I might be able to use, that, kind of a secret move." And his secret move was to parry, slide in on the blade, and then cut the back of the knee, the tendons in the back of the knee. Because in armor, you have to leave that open. Even if you're wearing chainmail, it's much less armored or protected. And in this case, most of the time they were not wearing chainmail pants, for they were fighting on foot, just too heavy. And so he did. They fought for a while. He went in, he sliced the back of the guy's leg. He went down. They removed him to the pavilion to try and stitch it up, but they didn't have the capability to really fix it. And he would have been crippled for life. And he was so upset, he ripped off the bandages and bled to death. The other side of that was he was the favorite of the king, and the king was so sure that his guy was going to win. He had a big pavilion full of food for the big party afterwards. And when the guy died, the king was so disgusted, he left, and the populace went in, looted the pavilion, had a great feast. But the Coupe de Jarnac had to flee to another country but it's called the Coupe de Jarnac, the cut of Jarnac. But there's a lot of wounds like that were unhealable. Yeah. If you were a sword fighter who had been in any kind of battles for any length of time, you limped, or you were missing a finger, or you had scars on you that you woke up in the morning and you ached like crazy. There was a reason Athos drank a lot of wine. He ached a lot from a lot of fights. The other thing people don't realize is Athos was probably the ancient age of about 30. He was the old guy. D'Artagnan was 16, and Aramis and Athos and Porthos were probably around 20, because you just didn't live that long then. Yeah. Certainly not in a profession where you were either under fire or being stabbed on a regular basis.
If someone's writing a current day story and they have someone who's stabbed or otherwise injured with a bladed weapon, can you give some guidelines about what would be an actual realistic recovery time? And maybe you can assume like one scenario where the person actually has access to medical care and one where they don't. Can you give some guidelines about that?
Yeah. If you're stabbed, but depends where you're stabbed. They're really, like in Mannix and in a lot of Westerns, they're really big on getting shot in the arm or shot in the leg. And they usually just put a handkerchief on it and wander off. By the end of the hour, they're wandering around. If you're shot in the leg, you're done. It's the largest artery in the body, the largest muscle group. You're going to walk like Chester if you recover. If you're stabbed, it depends if it's in a muscle group, how much tissue damage is to it. So realistically, let's say it's a 4-inch knife. You get cut badly on the forearm and then stabbed in the leg before you break a bottle over the guy's head and he's out. Well, the forearm, if it's a cut, chances are it'll be stitched up. Unless he cut tendons, a couple of weeks from then, it'll be sore for quite a while, and you may always feel the weather, but you'll be fine. If he stabs you in the thigh, that could be months of recovery time because it went deeper, and they would actually have to do surgery internally to sew up the layers because, we are basically onions, and why we cry so much. But if your hero has a deep cut like that on the leg, it could be months before they can walk normally, if ever, really. And like I said, if you're cut on the back of that's what they say. If you're in a knife fight, you want to control where you're cut. If you're cut here, there's less damage than if you cut here. If you cut here, it's all the tendons that work your hand.
And you're saying just for people who are just listening,
if you're cut on the outside of the arm, the outside of the arm, if you're going to get cut or slashed, even in the bicep or tricep area, is the least of two evils. If you're cut on the inside, you have all of the tendons that operate your fingers, and you have a major vein, again, that runs on the inside. The brachial vein runs on the inside of the bicep. So you want to protect that. There's a reason we're built like a cage. We are basically a layer of suet on top to help protect the bones so they're not brittle. And that's fine for slashes or contact wounds. A stab can go through and between those bones. So that's why it's always more dangerous. There's the very famous moment in the historical battle of Agincourt where the French were so jammed together because the English stopped the front line with their longbows, but the French were so anxious to get going, they kept moving. So the back lines kept piling up on top of the front lines, and they had their distance so that the English just kept shooting bows at them. And they got to the point where they couldn't swing their swords. And the big cry was, estoc, stab, stab, because it was the only way they could fight. And also when you're wearing armor, stabbing is actually more effective if you can get to the joints. when we think of knightly combat, their main weapon was a hammer because you were wearing a tin can. You can't cut that. So they would basically use blunt force weapons, or they would have a pick. One side would be a flat hammer and the other side would be like what we think of as a railroad pick.
Mhm.
You would try to use the pick to get through the armor and pry the guy out. So, and while knights could move very fluidly, up until recently, maybe 30 years ago or 40 years ago, the myth, because historians never put on armor, the historians were like, that must be really heavy, because historians are like, they sit in places and read books. But you got guys who actually put the armor on when it's fitted for them. It actually is lighter than modern combat gear and is suspended for more points. A full suit of armor might have 80 points of suspension. You wore an arming coat underneath it. Each section was connected. And it might weigh 60, 80 pounds. Modern combat gear that a Marine might wear, like going into Afghanistan, 120 pounds. And it's basically just over the shoulders and the waist. So it's only got 3 points of suspension. Yeah. I liken it to modern day firefighters. All of their gear, knights could move faster and more nimbly. They could swim. They could climb. They could swing on ropes, because otherwise no castle would have ever been invaded. So the illusion that knights were big and clumsy and couldn't move very well was not true. They also were the best fed of the people. They had the most meat. I mean, that's why the Royal Guards are called the beef eaters. They got the highest percentage of actual meat and vegetables. They didn't have to live off millet and leeks. They also had a more nutritious diet, which gave them more energy, the higher calorie count.
Well, I wanted to wrap up with one more question. This is to bring it back to writers who are writing more current day knife fights or bladed weapons fights. And is there a movie scene that you think does an especially good job?
The best knife fight I can think of is the William Friedkin movie, The Hunted. And it's Benicio del Toro and Tommy Lee Jones. And they have this brilliant knife fight in it. They have a little bit of Wolverine thing going on. They really play the wound, but not as serious as it would really be. That it wouldn't have had that much adrenaline to keep going after they're stabbed a couple of times. But it's very realistic in the sense that they are two experts who know each other, so that they really can do a fight checkmate kind of thing realistically. And it's not terribly drawn out, but it gives you a real sense of a visceral sword fight, of knife fight. The other one, believe it or not, there's a Japanese film with Christopher Lambert called The Hunted. And the premise of it is Christopher Lambert, who sees a murder happen and sees the face of one of the ninjas. They think they kill him, but he's not killed. And this martial arts sect, it's contemporary, but this martial arts sect that has been fighting this ninja sect forever finds out he's alive, and they have to protect him. It has some of the most realistic sword fights, and it's contemporary, and it's like 1990. But there's a fight on a train, which is phenomenal, where he's literally fighting guys in the middle of the smoking car, basically, on a train. It very much kind of has Highlander vibes in that sense. Brilliantly shot. But both movies are called The Hunted. So you have a nice, realistic and well done knife fight, and another slightly less realistic but really well done sword fights in the Lambert movie.
Well, DJ, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. I appreciate you sharing your insights and expertise with us. And please let the listeners and viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
I have a website called theurbanswashbuckler.com. My books are on Amazon. I have Dragon Throat, which is a novel of Altiva, which is a sword and fantasy, and Journey to Storm Rest, same series. And I have a book about a modern day ninja, which I call Martial Arts Noir. It's a murder mystery story, but his mother was an assassin for the Japanese during World War II, and he was raised by Mama-san, taught him, how to kill people. And it's called Killing Shadows, that are both out from Airship 27. And I'm around. I'm on Facebook with Teel James Glenn, Teel James Glenn, and it's very hard for me to hide. I'm too big.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.